On an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in the town of Flaxford, the bell of St. Cuthbert's Church rang at precisely 8:17 in the morning. The time is worth noting for two reasons. First, because the bell had not rung at that hour in living memory, and second, because it was the funeral bell. It did a slow, deliberate toll traditionally reserved for announcing to the town that death had visited. Its sound moved across Flaxford with ponderous dignity, drifting over rooftops still beaded with night's dampness. Shopkeepers paused midway through unlocking their doors. Postmen stepped more solemnly along their routes. The elderly residents, who knew what the bell meant, stopped and listened with narrowed eyes as though trying to guess the name behind the toll. This would have been perfectly ordinary were it not for the inconvenience of no one, to anyone's knowledge, actually having died, Mrs. Dulcie Hargreaves, whose mornings were as brisk and unquestionable as military manoeuvres, stopped dead in the act of selecting tomatoes from the greengrocer's stall. "Dear God," she murmured, "I told Arthur not to look so ruddy cheerful at breakfast." The bell tolled on. From the window of the police station, Inspector Purbright heard the bells, though only in the manner of a man who notices most things without finding it necessary to let them alter the rhythm of his tea. He sat at his desk, glasses perched low, reading a report on the recent arrival of a firm called North Midlands Memorial Investments Limited, who claimed to offer modern approaches to dignified passage and remembrance. The phrasing alone had made Purbright suspicious, though not enough to disturb his cup. Sergeant Malley, entering, paused mid-sentence.
"Sirs, is that?"
"It is," Purbright replied gently.
"But no one's—" "Apparently not. They waited for the bell to cease, which it did."
After 12 measured tolls, Purbright took a sip of tea. "Well," Sergeant Malley said, "someone will be along shortly to tell us exactly what happened."
"Yes,"
Purbright agreed. "Or, more likely, what they think happened." And indeed, only 8 minutes later, the station door burst open to admit Mr. Edwin Limbury, the church verger, known locally for a permanent expression suggesting a personal acquaintance with sorrow. "Inspector," he exclaimed, his voice a mixture of scandal and exhausted outrage.
"It's happened!"
Purbright looked up pleasantly. "Ah, yes. Do sit down, Mr. Limbury." Limbury sat, but not in the manner of one accustomed to chairs. He appeared to collapse onto it, arms flung like ropes. "That bell, Inspector, was tolled this morning." "Tolled?" "So I understand. Someone pulled the rope." "The rector is quite beside himself. We assumed you'd want to know immediately." "It was thoughtful of you," Purbright said.
"Is the rope damaged?" "Damaged? No, though I did find it—" Limbury paused, searching for a phrase that conveyed his personal affront.
"Disturbed. A difficult state to diagnose in rope," Purbright murmured. Limbury drew himself upright. It was still swinging when I entered the belfry. "And no one was there?"
"No one, Inspector."
"The door was not even locked." This, in Flaxford, was more than mere procedural negligence. It bordered on blasphemy, theft, and romantic scandal all at once. Purbright steepled his fingers. "Mr. Limbury, may I ask whether there is anyone believed to be near death? Anyone whose passing might have been anticipated?" Limbury blinked. "Well, there is Mrs. Hogbin, but she has been near death for 8 years now. I should hardly think today would be the day she obliges." "Quite so." Outside, footsteps hesitated beneath the station window. The town was beginning to gather its conclusions. Purbright rose, folding his report neatly. "Let us walk to St. Cuthbert's, shall we?" The church sat at the gentle crest of Fairley Lane, a modest but respectable stone building, its tower bearing an expression of mild, permanent disapproval. The morning's damp had begun to lift, leaving the graveyard smelling faintly of moss and memory. The Reverend Markby awaited them in the nave, his demeanour one of flustered piety. He cleared his throat at least twice before speaking. "Inspector, this is exceedingly embarrassing." "Only if it was intentional," Purbright said. "And only if someone meant embarrassment." Reverend Markby blinked. Purbright examined the bell rope, The frayed end was slightly smudged with something, a faint greenish tint, not quite mould, not quite paint. He raised no comment. Instead, he asked, "Is the record of burials up to date?"
"Of course. I maintain the ledger myself. May I see it?"
The Reverend hesitated just slightly too long. The ledger was produced, a thick, well-inked volume. Purbright turned the pages slowly. The most recent entry was from 3 weeks earlier, a Mr. Percival Griggs, interred with reliable solemnity. Then Purbright noticed something. Between the last written page and the back cover was a single missing leaf, torn neatly along the binding. "Ah," Purbright murmured,
as though he had found exactly the sort of thing one expects to find in a burial ledger. The Reverend went pale. Limbury swallowed. Purbright closed the book gently. "Well," he said with mild pleasantness, "I believe the town is about to become
talkative, and indeed it already had. The bells 12. Funereal tolls had hardly faded into the slate-grey air before Flaxford entered. Its most vigorous sport, the careful and determined spreading of unverified information, though no formal messenger carried the news. It travelled with remarkable efficiency, riding on errands layered into greetings, and tucked behind the most innocent remarks. By 11 o'clock, the impressionable, the idle, and the merely sociable were united in a broad agreement that something of grave significance had occurred, though exactly what varied according to who was speaking, who was listening, and what either of them wished privately to be true. At the Golden Sheaf, the town's primary establishment for what patrons liked to call a restorative morning half, the matter was debated with a seriousness that would have befitted a parliamentary inquiry. Mrs. Florence Blagg, a woman whose sense of civic duty was chiefly expressed through the relentless gathering of others' affairs, leaned forward at her table, lowering her voice while ensuring that those nearby could still hear. "It is my understanding," she said, "that the bell was rung for a funeral of a certain person of local standing, whose departure the family wishes to keep. Discreet, her companion, 2 women, who owed their loyalty to Florence primarily because detaching from her group would require a social courage neither possessed, nodded with grave sympathy. "But who?" whispered one. Florence tilted her head with the air of someone considering whether discretion was a virtue or merely an obstacle. "Well," she began, "we cannot overlook the curious inactivity at the undertaker's these past days.
One wonders whether—" But she did not finish,
because at that moment the door opened, and in walked Mr. William Rudge, proprietor of the town's only funeral service, and a man who carried himself like someone forever prepared to apologize for existing. He removed his hat, saw Mrs. Blagg, and immediately regretted leaving his house that morning. She called to him at once, "Mr. Rudge, you've come from the church, I presume?" Rudge's shoulders dropped. "No, Mrs. Blagg, I've just been to collect some linseed oil from painters." "Aha," Florence breathed, as though this confirmed something crucial. Rudge opened his mouth, closed it again, and, with the air of a rabbit abandoning resistance, walked directly to the counter to order a cup of tea. The matter of the missing ledger page had not yet reached the Golden Sheaf. That was still making its delicate way along the path of clergy, choir, women's guild members, and that infinitesimally swifter group, the women who were not in the guild but very much wished to know what the guild knew. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright walked slowly back toward the police station. His face conveyed neither urgency nor complacency. Rather, he looked like a man considering the weather and finding it unsurprising. Beside him, Sergeant Malley trod with the expression of someone waiting for a pronouncement. "You think the missing page is important, sir?"
Malley asked. "I think," Purbright replied gently, "that missing pages rarely remove themselves for purposes entirely innocent. Someone stole it to hide a name?"
"Possibly," Purbright smiled faintly. "Or to suggest one," Malley blinked.
"I'm afraid I don't. No matter," Purbright said kindly.
"We shall let the town work for us a little.
It will talk.
It always does, talk it did, at the post office. The theory was that the bell had been rung for a secret burial conducted at dawn to protect the deceased's identity, possibly due to scandal, espionage, or third-best cousinhood to royalty. Evidence, none. Enthusiasm, considerable. At the grocer's, someone claimed confidently that the deceased was Mrs. Hogbin, the perpetual invalid. This version was immediately disputed by someone who had just seen Mrs. Hogbin in her garden, shouting at her cat with unmistakable vigour. At the ladies' hairdressing salon, the rumour took a more delicate turn. It was rung for someone dead, yes, but not recently dead, confided Miss Pollard, the senior stylist, who spoke with the weight of one who believed all mysteries could be solved through correct handling of perms. So,
A late death being recognised now?
Asked her client, hopeful for something morally improving. Well, Miss Pollard said with meaningful pause, you know the church accounts have been
Odd. The client gasped ecstatically. By the time the day reached its quiet middle, the town had not so much arrived at a conclusion as it had grown fond of several.
Yet among all this arrangement of embroidered truths, there were a few figures who said nothing at all. One such figure was the vicar, Reverend Markby, who sat alone in his study, staring at the closed burial ledger. He had taken to pressing his hands flat against the desk, as if trying to steady an object that might float away. Another was Mr. Limbury, the verger, who smoked an anxious cigarette in the churchyard, looking up at the bell tower with wounded suspicion, and a third was Mr. Rudge, who sat in the undertaker's back room, staring at a wooden box lid propped against the wall. He appeared very much like a man rehearsing what he would say, and more importantly, what he would not say, should certain questions arise. Purbright did not hurry. He rarely did. That was how people talked to him, filling silences they mistook for invitation. But it was late afternoon when the first distinctly useful piece of information arrived. It came, as useful information so often did, in the form of Mrs. Felicity Appleforth, a woman for whom remembering things was an art that improved with reinterpretation. She arrived at the station with a brisk flurry of coat and handbag, settling herself before being asked, "Inspector, I have something you may wish to know." Purbright folded his hands pleasantly. "I am sure I shall." "I was out early this morning," she began, which was true. Early rising gave her the full day to supervise the moral behaviour of others, and as I passed the churchyard gate I saw someone there. "Someone?" Purbright echoed. "A person," Mrs. Appleforth clarified, as though narrowing matters considerably, dressed in a dark coat. They went in through the side gate, very quietly, and I assure you, Inspector, they were not attending to spiritual needs. Mally blinked. "You recognize them?" Mrs. Appleforth looked deeply offended. "I would never claim to recognize someone I could not be absolutely certain of identifying."
"I'm not Mrs. Blagg." Purbright's eyes glimmered the faintest amusement. "Did you observe them enter the church?"
he asked. Mrs. Appleforth paused, not to think, but to rearrange her memory into something pleasing. "I did not see them enter, but they did not come out." That statement in Flaxford was practically a confession. Purbright thanked her warmly, which Mrs. Appleforth accepted as her due. She left convinced she had advanced the cause of justice by at least 3 stages and would be admired accordingly. When she had gone, Mally asked, "Do you think she actually saw anything?" "Oh yes," Purbright said. "The question is what?" Outside, evening crept slowly through Flaxford.
Lamps flickered to life.
The bell tower stood silent, as though deeply conscious of itself. And somewhere very near, a person who should not exist anymore was waiting to see whether the town would discover them first. The following morning arrived with a sky the colour of diluted porridge, a hue Flaxford had come to accept as its default setting. Inspector Purbright stepped out of the station shortly after 9, coat buttoned and expression faintly thoughtful. as though contemplating the habits of migrating birds rather than a potential ecclesiastical misdemeanor. Sergeant Malley accompanied him, mostly because Malley had a belief, both sincere and outdated, that detectives ought to be shadowed by dependable subordinates. Purbright did not object. Malley's straightforward nature had its uses. The inspector often considered him a sort of mobile barometer, highly sensitive to sudden changes in emotional weather. They walked to St. Cuthbert's without haste. The church tower rose ahead, square and sensible, as though reassuring the town that nothing improper could possibly occur within sight of it, which of course made the improper all the more likely. The vestry door was open. A faint smell of polish and cold stone greeted them. Inside stood Mr. Limbury, the verger, extremely busy. He was wiping the organ stool with a devotion that suggested great personal sacrifice, though the stool appeared already clean enough to perform surgery upon. He glanced up with the melancholy of someone discovering that tragedy persists despite one's best efforts to prevent it. "Ah," he said,
voice-laden.
"Inspector." "Good morning, Mr. Limbury," Purbright replied cheerfully. "You seem industrious," Limbury sighed, the sigh of a man whose burdens were numerous, largely self-appointed, and highly treasured. "One must do what one can," he intoned. Purbright nodded sympathetically, then asked, in the mildest possible tone, "Has Reverend Markby arrived?" Limbury's face tightened. "He's in his study," he said, with the air of one naming a location associated with delicate neurosis. "I should warn you, Inspector, the rector has not slept well. The matter has distressed him." Malley glanced reflexively at Purbright. Purbright's face did not alter. "Let us disturb him as gently as possible. Then," he said. Reverend Markby's study was lined with books in various stages of death, some desiccated with age, others close to collapse from overuse. The Reverend sat behind his desk, spectacles crooked, hands folded, attempting dignity and just failing. "Inspector Purbright," he said, with a smile both weary and hopeful.
"Forgive me if I seem—"
"Not quite myself today." "Of course," Purbright said warmly. "Unexpected bells rarely improve one's equilibrium." The Reverend nodded, a gesture of faint gratitude for a joke that did not require laughter. Purbright took a seat. "I should like to discuss the missing page in your burial."
"Ledger," he said. Reverend Markby inhaled sharply. "Yes," he said. "That is unfortunate, unusual," Purbright suggested. Markby swallowed.
"Very. Who handles the ledger?" Purbright asked. "I do," Markby said, "almost exclusively. Occasionally Mr. Limbury retrieves it for me at my request. But I am the one who writes in it." Purbright inclined his head. "Has it been out of your possession recently?" The Reverend hesitated. "Not long, but long enough. Last Thursday," he said slowly. "It was needed for a meeting with the rural dean. I placed it on the vestry table. When I returned some hours later, it was—"
"Exactly where I left it, though 1 page lighter,"
Purbright said gently. Markby's eyes closed a moment. Yes, there was silence. Not tense, simply thoughtful. It was Malley who broke it. "Was anything written on that page, sir?" The Reverend hesitated again. "Yes," he said softly. "But the entry was—"
"Not a burial." Purbright did not move.
He waited. Markby's voice became quieter still. "It was a transfer of remains."
"A reinterment."
The coffin of someone long buried was moved to another plot. "At the request of surviving family," Purbright blinked very mildly. "And whose remains were they?" The Reverend swallowed. "Mr. Ambrose Quill died 5 years ago." Malley frowned. "Never heard of him, sir." "You would not have," the rector murmured. "He was not from here. He was brought to Flaxford to be buried by a niece."
"A Miss Quill. She no longer lives in the parish." Purbright leaned back.
Not in surprise, but in the comfortable way of a man accepting information that fits a pattern only he can currently see. "And the family requested the removal recently?" "Yes, though I never spoke to the family myself." "The request came through the undertaker, Mr. Rudge?" "Yes." Purbright gazed at a small dust mote floating near a beam of light, as though it contained wisdom. What date was the reinterment performed? 2 weeks ago? And was there a ceremony? Markby looked pained. The family did not attend. It was quiet. How quiet? Purbright asked, voice still utterly pleasant. So quiet, Markby admitted, that I performed it alone. In the early morning, no hymns?
Only the minimum prayers, and the coffin was removed to where?
Reverend Markby looked even more distressed. It was taken away by Mr. Rudge, he said.
I do not know its destination, I asked.
He said the family preferred privacy in their grief. Purbright smiled in a way that was not unkind, but was entirely alert. I see. Limbury, who had drifted nearer in the way of a man who deeply wished to overhear propriety's undoing, erupted suddenly. You see, Inspector, I told Reverend Markby it was improper, moving a coffin without a proper service.
I said so at the time.
You said it afterward, Limbury, the Reverend snapped, his voice cracking.
And loudly.
In the cemetery. To 3 choir boys and the milkman. Someone had to, Limbury replied. With tragic nobility, Purbright rose. Gentlemen, he said, with calm gentleness that restored order in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. I am sure we shall determine the meaning of all this in due time. Markby sagged with relief. He had been prepared for reprimand and found himself spared. Purbright, however, was not finished. One last thing, he said. The bell. Could either of you think of anyone connected to Mr. Quill, or his reinterment, who might have reason to signal the town? Limbury stared gloomily at the stone floor. Markby shook his head helplessly. No one, he said. Mr. Quill has no family left here. And the niece who arranged his burial left Flaxford years ago. Purbright paused, coat half-buttoned. Did she? Yes, Markby said.
Quite suddenly, after the funeral.
No explanation. Purbright nodded, very mildly, as though considering the taste of an unfamiliar tea blend. Then, thank you, Reverend. I shall speak next with Mr. Rudge. Outside, Mally exhaled long and low. Sir, do you think someone moved the wrong coffin? Purbright smiled faintly. No, Mally.
I think someone moved the right coffin they walked on, and I suspect, Purbright added calmly, that Mr. Ambrose Quill is either not in his new resting place,
or was never meant to be resting at all. The Flaxford Town Council prided itself on a brisk, business-like approach to matters of public order, by which it meant that important decisions were to be announced with gravity and confidence, regardless of how little basis they had in fact. Thus, it came as no surprise to Inspector Purbright when he and Sergeant Mally were summoned, a term here meaning politely instructed to attend, promptly and with good posture, to a special midday meeting chaired by Councillor Lionel Harbidge. Councillor Harbidge was a man who had, through a combination of volume and waistcoat, achieved an aura of municipal authority that was not to be questioned, at least not while he was present. He stood now at the head of the long, polished oak table like a benevolent but impatient locomotive. Inspector, Harbidge began, clasping his hands on his stomach as if holding in a lecture of considerable importance. I trust you are aware of the bell incident. I am, yes, Purbright replied, with polite mildness. And that you are investigating the matter? Indeed, Harbidge nodded, allowing the illusion that he had authorized this investigation. Well then, he declared, I believe we may close the matter today. Purbright made a soft, agreeable sound. Mally did not quite manage to hide his skepticism. Harbidge continued, It is perfectly evident that some mischievous youth, likely one of the regrettable sort who spend their evenings loitering near the recreation ground, slipped into the church and rang the bell purely for amusement. There was a general murmur of approval from the councillors, not because the explanation was persuasive, but because it was comfortably simple. Harbidge's voice warmed to his theme. Such delinquent impulses stem, I need not remind the council, from laxity in parental expectations and an excess of leisure. Purbright cleared his throat so gently it would not have disturbed a kitten. "Councillor Harbidge," he said pleasantly, "may I ask what led you to conclude it was a child?" Harbidge blinked. "Caught mid-oration. It is the most likely explanation." "Bells do not ring themselves," Purbright nodded. "Quite so. And yet the bell in question is rather heavy. It's rope frayed, its mechanism stubborn. One would require some determination." "Well," Harbidge said, recovering, "young people can be quite determined when occupied improperly. Malley spoke before he meant to. With respect, sir, this wasn't done for a lark." A funeral bell rings slow and steady. Someone knew the cadence. A slight hush settled. This was the flaw in the mischievous youth. Hypothesis: children rarely perform pranks with perfect traditional solemnity. Councillor Harbidge brushed it aside. Then perhaps it was one of those idle older fellows who wander about at dawn with inexplicable purpose. At this, Alderman Creech, who was such a fellow, stiffened visibly. Purbright remained perfectly amicable. "There is also the matter," he said, as though commenting on weather patterns, "of the missing burial ledger page." The councillors shifted, now less comfortable. Harbidge stared. "Missing?" Purbright inclined his head in a way that was not dramatic, but was devastatingly calm. "Yes. Removed with care. And the last entry concerned a reinterment performed by Mr. Rudge." Councillor Harbidge's expression rearranged itself slowly, like furniture being moved by someone reluctant to admit the purpose. "Well," he said, "I suppose that could suggest the undertaker has become careless with papers." "No suggestion of wrongdoing?" Purbright asked, gently probing. Harbidge laughed a little too brightly. "Rudge? Good heavens, no. A more timid soul I've not met. He's terrified of criticism. That," Purbright murmured, "is sometimes the difficulty." Harbidge did not understand, nor was he intended to. Purbright stood. "If it pleases the council," he said pleasantly, "I should prefer not to conclude the matter prematurely." Harbidge opened his mouth to object, then seemed to think better of it. One did not argue with Inspector Purbright. One merely waited for him to finish appearing reasonable. "Very well," Harbidge conceded, "but I should like the investigation concluded with a firm account to restore civic confidence." "That is always my aim," Purbright said, smiling in a way that meant something entirely different. When they had left the council building and stepped into the pale midday light, Malley exhaled. "He wants it solved because it's comfortable, sir." "Comfort," Purbright agreed, "is a story that asks for no further details." Malley considered that. "And we," he said slowly, "are rather in the business of details." Purbright's smile returned, faint, thoughtful, amused. "Yes, Malley. We are." They walked, the town slow and ordinary around them. A cyclist passed. A shopkeeper swept his step. A sparrow hopped along a stone wall, entirely unconcerned with mysteries. Flaxford looked quite unchanged, but someone had meant for that bell to ring. Someone had wanted the town to believe that death had occurred. And, Purbright reflected quietly, it is always interesting when someone wishes to suggest death more than they wish to cause it. The bell rope hung in its shaft like any other length of aging hemp, rough, frayed, and resigned. Yet Inspector Purbright stood before it once more on the morning following the council meeting with a patience bordering on fondness. He observed not the rope itself, but the small, quiet things about it, the tiny pulls of fibre, the hesitation of twist, the marks one leaves without meaning to. Sergeant Malley stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back in the stance of a boy caught somewhere between being helpful and being confused. "Looks like rope." "Sir?" Malley offered. "Yes," Purbright agreed, "but rope that has been held recently, and by someone who does not handle such things often." Malley blinked. "How can you tell that?" Purbright gestured, not dramatically, but with almost professorial gentleness. "See how the pressure marks are uneven? Someone squeezed too tightly, then too loosely. A habitual ringer pulls smoothly. This hand did not. Mally leaned closer, dutifully. "And what about that smudge?" he asked. "The greenish tinge?" Purbright touched it with the back of one finger. "Barely. It is not mildew, nor paint. It is wax." "Wax?" Mally frowned harder.
"From a candle?"
"Of a sort." But Purbright offered no further clarification. He merely continued to examine the belfry as though awaiting a thought. Down in the nave, Mr. Edwin Limbury, the verger, paced anxiously,
hands clasped behind his back like a man rehearsing indignation for an audience that had not yet arrived. When the inspector returned from the tower, Limbury swooped toward him. "Well?"
he demanded, with the eagerness of one who expects terrible news that will justify all his gloomy suspicions about others. "The bell rope is in rather ordinary condition," Purbright replied pleasantly. Limbury deflated, but only momentarily. Indignation rises quickly in men who treasure it, but someone rang it. "Yes," said Purbright.
"Someone did, and they must be held accountable."
Purbright smiled. "Quite possibly, Mr. Limbury." This was a special form of reassurance, one which provided comfort without promising satisfaction. Outside, in the pale sunlight, Purbright and Mally walked the short path across the churchyard, weaving gently among the stones. Moss had made quiet allies of the older memorials, softening dates and dissolving once bold commemorations into polite suggestion. "Sir," Mally ventured, "if it was wax—"
"Then someone had been holding a candle when they rang the bell."
Purbright nodded, the slow, thoughtful motion of a man tasting a theory he already found agreeable. "A candle?" he said, "or perhaps more than one, and not the sort used for prayer." Mally stared at him. "What other kind is there?" Purbright smiled. "There are candles used for sealing." Mally blinked again, a common state when accompanying the inspector through deductive territory. "You mean—"
"Sealing letters?"
"Among other things," Purbright said. "And green wax," Mally added slowly, gears beginning to turn, "is often used for official documents," Purbright finished. They walked on in silence for a time. Their path took them past the parish newspaper box, where a few copies of the weekly Flaxford Clarion sat waiting for the curious. The Clarion rarely contained anything more inflammatory than notices of amateur theatricals and complaints about the scheduling of rubbish collection. But that morning, someone had taken the liberty of writing, in neat handwriting on the box's side, who was the bell for. Mally sighed. "Town's getting restless." "Yes," Purbright said quietly. "Restlessness is when mistakes begin." They found Mr. William Rudge, the undertaker, not in his parlour where tasteful gloom prevailed, but in the yard behind it, hunched over a piece of furniture not yet certain of its purpose. The smell of wood shavings hung in the air.
Rudge looked up with the anxious expression borrowed from small woodland creatures. "Oh," he said.
"Inspector, Sergeant." "Good morning, Mr. Rudge," Purbright greeted, with the easy civility of someone meeting a neighbour rather than a subject of inquiry. Rudge's hands were dusty. His sleeves rolled up, a rare departure from his usual formal black. "Making something?" Mally asked. Rudge hesitated. "A display case for memorial cards."
"I thought, well, some families like—" He trailed off, doomed by his own sincerity.
Rudge was not a man built for deception, which made the very possibility of his lying interesting. Purbright gestured politely toward the back corner of the yard. "And that," he asked mildly, "is also for display?" Rudge froze. There, leaning behind a small shed, was a coffin lid, not new, not old, recently handled, and beside it, faintly visible on the wood grain, a smear of something green. Rudge stared at it as though seeing it for the first time. "Oh," he whispered.
"Yes, I hadn't yet disposed of that. From Mr. Quill's reinterment?"
Purbright asked, still perfectly pleasant. Rudge swallowed. Yes, he whispered. And where is the rest of the coffin now? Purbright asked. Rudge's face had gone grey, a colour that suited neither life nor business. It was... Rudge stammered.
It was taken. I delivered it, as instructed. To whom?
Purbright asked. Rudge wrung his hands helplessly. A man, he said.
A man who said he represented the family. He had papers, sealed, with green wax. Mally opened his mouth to speak.
Purbright raised a hand very slightly and Mally closed it again. And you did not question him? Purbright asked. Rudge's breath came short and quick. He had the authority, Inspector. Or he looked as if he did. Purbright studied him a gentle moment. Yes, he said, softly. That is often enough. Rudge looked as though he might shatter into tears, and apologies both. Purbright stepped closer, speaking with unusual kindness. Mr. Rudge, please understand that I am not here to accuse you. I am here because someone has involved you, and you deserve to know in what. Rudge looked up, eyes shining with miserable gratitude. Purbright continued. The bell was rung to signify a death, yet the death in question may not have occurred, or occurred long before.
Or not at all. Rudge's hands trembled. It was meant to warn someone, Purbright added quietly. Not mourn, Rudge blinked. And in that blink something shifted up. Not guilt, but recognition, as though he had remembered something he had not realized he knew. Inspector? He whispered.
There was something else. The man, the one who collected the coffin, he called Mr. Quill by a different
name. Purbright waited. He called him Harwood. Mally looked sharply at
Purbright. Harwood. A name that did not appear in the burial ledger or anywhere. Purbright smiled, the smallest, most thoughtful smile. Thank you, Mr. Rudge. You have been very helpful. As Purbright and Mally walked away, the inspector's pace was slow and contemplative. A new name, sir, Mally murmured.
That's something. Yes, Purbright said. A clue?
Purbright's eyes glimmered with quiet amusement. Oh, certainly, but not quite what it appears to be. He looked back once at the church tower, silent, watchful, patient. Now, he said softly, let us see who remembers the dead by the wrong name. In every English market town there exists at least one citizen whose life purpose is to ensure that no mystery remains unembellished. In Flaxford that role was admirably filled by Miss Felicity Appleforth. She was, in her own estimation, a great friend of truth, though in practice, truth tended to leave her company looking slightly overdressed and uncertain of itself. Her late father, a magistrate, had once remarked that his daughter's curiosity could extract gossip from an empty postbox. And on this particular Thursday morning, Miss Appleforth's curiosity had been fed a banquet. She appeared at the police station doorway precisely at 10, having fortified herself with 1 slice of toast, 2 cups of tea, and a thrilling sense of civic duty. Inspector Purbright, she announced grandly, I recall something further concerning the matter of the bell. Sergeant Mally, who had developed a reflexive twitch whenever she visited, called up the stairs without enthusiasm.
Sir, it's Miss Appleforth. Again, Purbright's voice floated down, warm as sunlight.
Ah, show her in, Sergeant. Miss Appleforth swept in like a ship under full sail,
hat trembling with energy. I have recollected.
Inspector, she began without pause, a detail which I think, indeed,
I am certain is of significance. Purbright gestured toward a chair.
I have never known your recollections to lack significance. Miss Appleforth, she smiled, uncertain whether she was being complimented, and decided to assume she was. Well, she began, leaning forward conspiratorially, you recall I mentioned seeing a person near the churchyard at dawn.
A dark coat?
Quiet manner, yes?
Well, she paused dramatically.
I believe I can say with confidence that the individual was not a stranger. Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly. Indeed? Indeed, she affirmed. I did not realize it immediately, for the light was dim. But last evening, as I was watering my nasturtiums, I happened to glance toward the far gate of the cemetery, and there I saw a very similar figure. The same height, the same way of walking, though perhaps a touch more furtive. "And who?" Purbright asked gently. "Might that have been?" She lowered her voice. "Mr. Rudge?" Purbright's tone did not alter. "Mr. Rudge, the undertaker?" "The very same," she said, eyes bright with triumph, carrying something wrapped in canvas. "Quite rectangular." "Quite heavy, rectangular," Purbright echoed mildly. "Not unlike a box, perhaps?" Miss Appleforth's voice rose a fraction.
"Precisely."
I thought to myself, "Felicity, you are witnessing something unusual. But of course one hesitates to interfere in matters of burial."
"One doesn't wish to be mistaken for morbid." Mally coughed discreetly.
Purbright inclined his head. "Of course not." Miss Appleforth looked very pleased with her moral restraint. "But I felt it my duty to mention the incident this morning," she finished. "And you were quite right too," Purbright said. "You have a commendable memory, Miss Appleforth." "Thank you, Inspector," she said, rising, her civic virtue renewed. "I always say no detail is too small when it concerns public decency." "I entirely agree," Purbright said, smiling. She beamed and departed, leaving a faint trail of lavender scent and self-approval behind her. Mally waited until the door closed. "You don't believe her, sir?" "Oh, I believe she saw something," Purbright replied. "I'm simply less certain she saw it correctly." "She said it was Rudge, which would be both convenient and improbable," Purbright murmured. He picked up his hat. "Come along, Mally. We shall pay a quiet call on Mr. Rudge before the town hangs him in effigy." They found the undertaker's premises silent, but not deserted. Through the side window, Purbright saw movement, a shadow crossing between stacks of wooden panels. He knocked gently. Mr. Rudge opened the door, pale and red-eyed, as though sleep had become an unreliable companion. "Inspector," he said.
"I was just tidying." Purbright looked past him at the disordered workroom.
"You do seem industrious." "Couldn't rest," Rudge said simply. Purbright's voice remained kind. "You've had another visitor this morning, I believe." Rudge blinked.
"Visitor?"
"Miss Appleforth," Purbright said, "claims to have seen you at the cemetery last evening, carrying something wrapped in canvas." Rudge's face contorted into something between horror and confusion. "I've not been near the cemetery since your last visit, Inspector."
Not since I spoke to you." "Then she is mistaken?" "Entirely."
Mally, who had been examining a shelf, called softly, "Sir, there's a patch of green wax on this crate lid." Rudge turned sharply. That's from the seal on Mr. Quill's documents, the ones the man showed me." Purbright studied him.
"You haven't seen that man again?"
Rudge shook his head. "No, Inspector."
"And I hope I never do. He frightened me. In what way?"
"He was polite," Rudge said, voice trembling, "but his eyes, as if he were watching something behind you." Purbright nodded faintly, as though this were the sort of detail one files away for future reflection. Outside, on the narrow lane, Mally exhaled. "She's either lying or wrong, sir." "Possibly both," Purbright said. "Miss Appleforth's imagination is not so much inaccurate as independent." Mally frowned. "Still, if she saw a man carrying something from the cemetery—" "Then," Purbright interrupted softly, "she may have seen the same man who collected the coffin from Rudge and mistook him for Rudge himself." Mally stopped walking.
"You think he came back?"
Purbright's gaze drifted to the church tower, visible even from this street. "I think," he said, "that someone wished to check on a particular grave."
"Or ensure it was?"
"Still empty." That afternoon Flaxford hummed like a teapot left too long on the stove. The story had already mutated beyond recognition. By tea-time, Miss Appleforth's confident recollection had transformed into several distinct legends. According to Mrs. Blagg, Rudge had been seen digging by moonlight. According to the butcher's assistant, the coffin contained money, not bones. According to the choir boys, The bell was cursed and had told itself. Inspector Purbright listened to these evolutions with the calm of a man reading the tide schedule. Inevitable, predictable, mildly instructive. At dusk, he walked alone to St. Cuthbert's churchyard. The stones lay in long, uneven rows, each tilting like an old man nodding at a joke he didn't quite hear. The air was still. Even the sparrows seemed to have gone somewhere more lively. Purbright stopped beside the grave of Ambrose Quill, recently disturbed. The soil had settled again, but there was something faintly wrong. The pattern too neat, the grass replanted with uncharacteristic care. He crouched, brushing the earth lightly with his fingertips. There, half embedded in the soil, he found a thin sliver of green wax, brittle and gleaming faintly under the fading light. He smiled very slightly. "Curious," he murmured. Someone wanted to close what had already been opened. As he turned to leave, a faint movement caught his eye, the tower's shadow, shifting across the stones, and behind it, a figure near the lich gate. For a heartbeat, Purbright thought it might be Rudge. The height matched. The outline too. But as the figure turned, light caught on something metallic in his hand. Not a spade, not a lantern, something smaller, a seal press. Then the figure vanished behind the gate's arch and was gone. Purbright straightened slowly. His expression did not change, but his eyes, behind the mild spectacles, sharpened. He now knew that the wax was not simply residue. It was a signature, and the person who had left it was not done writing yet. Flaxford, for all its gentility, was no stranger to a certain quiet drama. It simply preferred that drama be wrapped in appropriate packaging, which is why the discovery behind Rudge and Son funeral services caused such an unhelpful level of excitement. It was Mrs. Cribbins who found it. Mrs. Cribbins, who cleaned the undertaker's rooms twice weekly and had been complaining for 11 years that she ought to be compensated for emotional strain, finally received the emotional strain she had been requesting. She arrived at the police station in a state best described as highly combustible shivering. "Inspector," she gasped, winded from both shock and enthusiasm.
There is Purbright, who had been carefully adding a small stack of case notes to a file, looked up pleasantly. "A body?" he asked, for it was statistically safest. "A box?"
Mrs. Cribbins declared.
"A coffin box.
"Behind the shed."
"And I am certain it has been used."
Mally blinked. Purbright put on his coat. The undertaker's yard looked unchanged from the previous day. Wood scraps, dust, the habitual melancholy of funeral furniture. But behind the small timber shed, half concealed by stacked folding trestles, lay a wooden coffin box, the underside of a coffin, the rectangular base with sides but no lid. It was clean. Too clean. Purbright crouched beside it. No soil.
No splinters? No lingering damp of burial.
Instead, faint streaks of fine grey dust inside the box. Not ash, not earth, Mally frowned. "What is that?" Purbright brushed it gently between two fingers. "Stone dust. From a grave?" Mally asked. "No." Purbright blew a bit of dust away. It dispersed too lightly. "From a tombstone."
Freshly carved. Mally tried to assemble this into a sentence. "So someone
took Mr. Quill's coffin, but replaced it with
something else?"
Purbright smiled, not because the matter was amusing, but because the puzzle now had shape. "They repackaged something," he said, "but not remains. Something that required the appearance of burial," Mally exhaled. "Something they needed to hide." Or, Purbright corrected gently, something they needed to declare gone. At that moment, Mr. William Rudge emerged from the building, breathless and pale. Mrs. Cribbins, seeing him, immediately adopted the posture of someone prepared to faint if needed, but not so urgently as to miss any details. "Mr. Rudge," Purbright greeted. "Do you recognize this box?" Rudge stared.
His hands shook. "Yes," he whispered.
"Yes? That That was Mr. Quill's. "The coffin the man with the green seal collected," Purbright prompted. Rudge nodded miserably. "But I didn't put it there."
"I swear it." Purbright believed him.
Rudge was not built for deceit. His lies came out wrinkled and apologetic. "Who has access to the yard?" Purbright asked. Rudge blinked.
"Only myself and the joiner who brings wood."
"And Reverend Markby, on occasion, when we rehearse processions." Mally gave Purbright a sideways glance at that. Purbright's voice remained soft. "And anyone with a key to the churchyard gate, which
"I believe includes Mr. Limbury, the sexton, and the choir's custodian." Rudge nodded helplessly. Mrs. Cribbins burst in. "And Miss Appleforth walks past every day."
"Don't think I haven't noticed."
"Spying like a hen through a hedge." "Thank you, Mrs. Cribbins," Purbright said kindly.
"Your observational vigilance is noted and I assure you, deeply valued." Mrs. Cribbins flushed with such pride that she forgot to tremble. Purbright turned back to the coffin box. "What was Mr. Quill buried with?" he asked Rudge. "Any personal effects?"
"Rings, documents, keepsakes,"
Rudge thought. "Only a small metal box, locked. The niece said it was sentimental in nature." "A locked box?" Purbright repeated. "Yes," Rudge whispered.
"She asked that it remain sealed inside the coffin." Mally swore under his breath. Purbright stood slowly.
"The missing ledger page," he said softly, "was not removed to hide the name of the dead. It was removed to hide the date of removal." Mally stared. "So someone wasn't hiding that a burial took place. They were hiding that the grave was reopened." Purbright nodded. "And they rang the funeral bell," Mally continued, thinking aloud now, "to make the town believe someone new had died." "Exactly," Purbright murmured. "A distraction."
"A signal," Rudge swallowed. "A signal to whom, Inspector?"
Purbright looked toward the church tower. Empty belfry, silent rope, too many eyes. To someone who needed to know that the coffin had been retrieved. They left the undertaker's yard, walking slowly toward the churchyard. The wind had begun to stir, rattling winter-bare branches. "Sir," Mally said, "if the coffin didn't contain Mr. Quill's remains, then where are they?"
Purbright's answer was quiet. "Oh, I believe Mr. Quill is still in Flaxford."
"He merely changed his name, and perhaps his life," Mally blinked.
"You think Mr. Quill is alive?"
Purbright smiled faintly. "I think someone very carefully arranged for the town to believe he was dead, and has now arranged just as carefully for the town to believe he has died again." Mally let out a low whistle. "But why?" Purbright's eyes, calm, steady, unobtrusively sharp, rested on the church tower. "To escape something," he said. "Or someone." Then after a pause and the person ringing the bell,
"Is not mourning him." He adjusted his coat cuff.
"They're warning him." That evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops and the shops shuttered one by one, a quiet movement stirred in the graveyard. Not the clatter of tools, not the scrape of shovels, but the soft, careful sound of a seal being pressed into wax. And somewhere beyond the lich gate, a man walked away, his coat blending into dusk, his steps unhurried. Not a ghost, but someone very concerned that one should be. Inspector Purbright had always considered the police station's tea room to be a place of contemplation, or at least a place where contemplation could convincingly pose as inactivity. On Thursday evening he sat there alone, watching steam rise from a cup that had been poured several minutes before. He was not thinking of wax or ropes or coffins, but of people, which is where most mysteries eventually settled when allowed to unfold at their own pace. The bell, the missing ledger page, the reinterred coffin, the green wax, they were not objects of crime so much as objects of intention. Someone had gone to trouble. Someone had taken care. Someone had not wished to be noticed, but wished very much to be understood by someone else. Purbright always found that more interesting than mere wrongdoing. After several quiet minutes, he rose, coat resting lightly on his arm, and stepped into the evening grey. The town was settling into its nightly self, curtains drawn, lamps glowing behind lace, the faint sense that gossip was resting only to gather strength. He walked without haste, for haste was a declaration of importance, and Purbright's value lay in never alerting a puzzle to the fact it was being solved. He found himself on the high street, where Mrs. Blagg and her 2 loyal satellites were leaving the post office, heads angled in formation like geese in migration. They paused, of course, for one could not allow the inspector to pass without the respectable sharing of information. "Inspector," Mrs. Blagg called with a flourish, suggesting she'd been waiting all evening to deliver precisely this greeting. Purbright paused politely. "Good evening, Mrs. Blagg. I do hope you are progressing in your inquiry," she said gravely, "for the town grows anxious." "Yes," Purbright said. "So I have observed." Mrs. Blagg absorbed this as praise, and, she pressed on, "I wonder if you may confirm a rumour, purely for the purpose of preventing unnecessary alarm." Purbright smiled pleasantly.
"I am always in favour of preventing unnecessary alarm." "Excellent," Mrs. Blagg declared.
"Then you can confirm that the undertaker has confessed." Purbright blinked, slowly, like a tortoise considering the sun. "No," he said. "I cannot." "Oh," said Mrs. Blagg, visibly disappointed but swiftly recalculating her advantage. "Well, I shall inform others accordingly." "You are kind," Purbright murmured, stepping onward. Behind him, the trio of women conferred with the hushed urgency of spies. The accuracy of the rumour had not improved, but its authority had. Flaxford's information economy operated on unusual principles. At length, Purbright reached the churchyard. The air carried the scent of damp stone and grass, the quiet of a place built for finalities. But there are finalities that turn out not to be final, which was, of course, the present difficulty. He walked the familiar path past the older gravestones,
The ones leaning like old fellows in conversation,
and stopped once more before Ambrose Quill's resting place, not a false grave, not an empty one, but not what it claimed to be. Someone had buried something else, and someone had taken Quill away. The question, as always, was why. Purbright stood, hands in pockets, looking not at the grave, but beyond it, in the way of one who understands that answers rarely sit where they are expected. He recalled then a conversation from years earlier, a case so minor no one remembered it but him, involving a clerk who altered parish records to avoid debt collectors, a quiet scandal spoken of in whispers, and the name of the man who assisted him, the name that had surfaced briefly and then disappeared just as politely. Harwood, not Quill, but a man who might have become Quill, or borrowed him. Identity, Purbright reflected, is not simply a name. It is the set of things a person stands to lose, and someone had gone to trouble to lose themselves twice. "Inspector?" came a soft voice. Purbright turned. Reverend Markby stood near the lich gate, coat drawn close, expression tired but earnest. The rector looked as a man does when worry is beginning to feel familiar. "I did not wish to intrude," Markby said gently. "But I saw you from the vestry window." Purbright nodded. The Reverend stepped closer. "I have been thinking," he said, "that perhaps I have mismanaged this situation. The missing page, the reinterment. I may have been too willing to believe what was presented."
"I wanted to be helpful."
"To be trusted." Purbright regarded him with sympathy rather than judgment. "Trust," he said, "is not a failing."
"But it can be a currency."
"And sometimes it is spent without our consent," Markby swallowed. "There is something you should know." Purbright waited. When the niece, Miss Quill, brought Ambrose here to be buried 5 years ago, she seemed
afraid, not grief-stricken. Not shocked, afraid. She did not speak during the service.
She left before the coffin was lowered. He paused. And the man who came for the coffin, Markby's voice tightened. He had the same manner, not mourning, watching. Purbright nodded slowly. Yes. I had suspected the burial was not an end, but a beginning of something else. The Reverend looked down. Do you think Ambrose Quill was a criminal? Purbright answered in his gentle way. I think someone believed he needed hiding. Markby shivered. And now, Purbright said, gaze drifting to the silent bell tower. Someone fears he is about to be found. They stood in silence a moment. The bell tower loomed, dignified and uninformative. Eventually, Purbright turned toward the gate. Thank you, Reverend. Your memory has been very helpful. Markby looked relieved, and a little frightened by what that implied. Purbright walked back down the lane.
Hands in pockets, coat stirring faintly in the breeze. He now knew almost enough. The town thought the bell had rung for death.
But it had rung for recognition, a signal, a message,
a summons. Someone in Flaxford now knew that their past had caught up, and Purbright,
with polite inevitability, would soon be needing to meet them. The advantage of small towns, Inspector Purbright reflected, was that one never needed to summon people. One merely allowed them to believe that they had been included in something, which is why, on Friday afternoon, a pot of tea and a plate of plain sponge cake were arranged in the vicarage sitting room, and 4 citizens of Flaxford sat politely together, each convinced the others were there for reasons entirely obvious, and that they themselves were merely being helpful. They were Reverend Markby, nervous but determined to seem composed, Mr. Edwin Limbury, who had insisted on attending uninvited to ensure matters of propriety were observed, Mr. William Rudge, pale and folding his hands so tightly his knuckles turned white, Miss Felicity Appleforth, breathless with the certainty she was assisting in a major criminal investigation, and, of course, Inspector Purbright, pouring tea as though hosting a conversation about garden mulch. Sergeant Malley remained by the door.
Not glaring, simply present. I am grateful to you all for coming, Purbright began,
with warmth that sounded entirely genuine, because, more or less, it was. This matter of the bell has unsettled the town.
And I thought it best we speak openly, keen and comfortably. 5 seconds of silence followed, in which no one wished to be the first to speak. Miss Appleforth yielded first.
I have always believed transparency is the moral backbone of society, she declared, for which she awarded herself silent credit. Quite so, Purbright said pleasantly. And transparency begins, I think, with the simplest question.
Who here believes they know why the bell was rung?
Limbury sat upright, face alight. It was an outrage, he announced. A sacrilege. Some miscreant. Yes, thank you, Mr. Limbury, Purbright interrupted kindly. But outrage is not motive. I'm curious who believes they understand the intention. Rudge's hands tightened further. Markby stared into his tea. Miss Appleforth looked like a fox waiting for hens to incriminate themselves. Purbright continued, voice light, let us consider instead the matter of names. Rudge looked up. Too quickly. Purbright went on. The man interred as Ambrose Quill 5 years ago was, in fact, known elsewhere as Mr. Harwood, a man who may have wished to cease existing in one identity and begin again in another. Miss Appleforth gasped joyfully, as if presented with a surprise opera performance. Reverend Markby stared at Purbright, realization dawning slow and heavy. Rudge closed his eyes. Purbright poured himself more tea. The removal of the coffin was not an act of theft, but of retrieval, and the ringing of the bell was not a memorial, but a signal, to inform someone still alive, that the past had been disturbed. He finally looked at Rudge, Mr. Rudge, the man who collected the coffin, the one you described as polite, quiet, and watchful. Did he look like someone who wished to mourn, or someone who wished to ensure silence? Rudge swallowed. He watched me the whole time, he whispered.
As if I were handling something explosive. No grief? Purbright asked. No, Rudge said, only...
Waiting, Limbry interjected. This is all very alarming, Inspector, but surely if the deceased is... Not deceased, Purbright smiled mildly. Then we have not had a resurrection, Mr. Limbry. We have had an absence of a burial. Miss Appleforth touched her throat with delighted horror. You mean someone hid the body? Purbright smiled. Oh, I think the body was never where we believed it to be. He let this sink in like tea into sponge. Then he stood, walking to the window looking out toward the churchyard. I believe Mr. Harwood, formerly Mr. Quill, is alive and has been living quietly in Flaxford. Possibly under yet another name, Markby whispered. Someone in this room? Purbright turned back. No, not in this room. Rudge's relief was visible, but someone known to each of you nonetheless. A man of reserved habits, one who would benefit from the town believing him gone, someone who receives few visitors, someone who might, now and then, be seen slipping into the church not for prayer exactly, but for assurance. He let the shape of the idea float in the room like incense. Miss Appleforth, who loved to be the first to understand a thing whether she did or not, breathed. Mr. Tolliver, the room stilled. Mr. Tolliver, who lived in the modest cottage behind the rectory garden, who rarely spoke, who arrived in Flaxford 5 years ago, quiet, polite, unobtrusive, a man who avoided close acquaintance with the fervour of one avoiding recognition. Purbright inclined his head, gently, precisely. Yes. Markby's hand caught the edge of the table. He volunteers in the vestry, tidying records, polishing candlesticks, and lighting sealing wax, Purbright finished. Green wax, clerical wax, which transfers easily to rope. Rudge stared at Purbright, stricken. He rang the bell, he whispered. Purbright nodded. To let the man who collected the coffin know that he knows who he is. And that he will not remain silent. Miss Appleforth pressed a hand to her mouth. Oh, she breathed. So it wasn't grief. It was leverage. Purbright gave her a mildly approving glance, the kind one gives a student who has finally arrived at the correct conclusion without causing conceptual harm along the way. Precisely, Limbry sputtered. But what does he want? Purbright sat again, very calm. What most people want when they finally confront a debt long owed. He lifted his teacup. A conversation. Outside in the churchyard, the shadows had lengthened. In the window glass, faint as breath, the bell tower's reflection loomed like a watchman awaiting its next word. Purbright's tone, when he spoke again, was soft, not ominous. Simply inevitable. I shall call on Mr. Tolliver tomorrow morning. Quietly. There is no need for alarm. He stood, and no need, he added, looking at Miss Appleforth with deliberate gentleness, for anyone to mention this gathering. Not yet. Miss Appleforth nodded, solemn with the gravity of someone entrusted with a state secret. For the first time in many years, she left a room without speaking, which, Purbright reflected, was proof enough. The case was now entering its final movement. The next morning dawned with a softness that suggested the weather had decided not to take sides. Thin sunlight lay across St. Cuthbert's churchyard, picking out the edges of gravestones and the chill glaze of dew. It was a morning that looked precisely as a morning ought, which made it, in Inspector Purbright's view, an excellent one in which to speak plainly. He and Sergeant Malley approached Mr. Tolliver's cottage with no haste at all. Purbright's step was measured, Mally's dutifully close behind. A sparrow hopped across the path, untroubled. The world, Purbright always felt, rarely interrupted itself for the truth. Mr. Tolliver answered the door almost before Purbright had finished raising his hand. He stood in the doorway wearing his customary dark coat, though he had not yet gone out. His expression was composed but tired, not in the way of the sleepless, but in the way of those who have been waiting. "Inspector," he said simply. "I wondered when you might come." Purbright inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying inevitability. "Good morning, Mr. Tolliver. May we come in?" Tolliver stepped aside with a faint gesture. The cottage interior was neat, unremarkable, scented faintly of paper and the clean wax used for preserving leather bindings. On a side table lay a small brass seal press, its handle still slightly green-stained. Mally looked at it, then at Purbright. Purbright, characteristically, looked at nothing in particular. Tolliver sat. Purbright did not at first. "Mr. Tolliver," he began, voice quiet and courteous, "I believe you were present in the church on Tuesday morning."
"Very early?" "Yes," Tolliver replied, without hesitation. "You rang the funeral bell." "Yes." Mally blinked. No attempt to deny, no fluster.
"Only a quiet acceptance?" Purbright nodded once. "You did not ring it in mourning?" "No," Tolliver said. "I rang it as a message." "Who was the message for?" Tolliver's gaze, steady but distant, fixed on the window where the bell tower could just be seen above the hedge. For a man who once called himself Ambrose Quill, and who once called himself Harwood, and who now calls himself something else and lives, very quietly, somewhere in Flaxford, Mally inhaled, not surprise, but confirmation. Purbright moved closer. "You knew him then?" Tolliver smiled.
"A thin and weathered thing. I did more than know him, Inspector."
"I worked beside him. We were auditors, government financial review.
Small departments.
Smaller towns. We inspected the places where ledger entries ought to match what was in the accounts." Mally frowned. "A fraud investigator?" Tolliver nodded. "Until one of us realized that fraud pays better when you stop investigating it." Purbright's voice was very soft. "And that one was Harwood." "Harwood," Tolliver repeated. With no sting, was remarkably gifted at paperwork. He knew how to make numbers look honest.
"I did not wish to be part of it. I spoke to a superior." He gave a weary, humourless breath.
The superior was already part of it. The memory sat between them, heavy but not dramatic. Truth rarely arrived with thunderclaps, Purbright often thought. More often it arrived like this, tired, inevitable, resigned. "I left the department," Tolliver continued, "but Harwood did something clever, or cowardly." A pause. "He made himself disappear. He invented a dead man."
Ambrose Quill. A quiet burial with no mourners, no funeral.
"A coffin and a grave for a man who never existed, and then he simply walked into another life." Mally looked stunned. Purbright looked mildly interested, as though hearing the final few bars of a familiar symphony. "And you followed him?" Purbright said. "Yes," Tolliver replied. "It took years, but I recognized certain habits.
Old signatures. A fondness for ledgers written by hand.
A way of walking that thinks before each step."
"I found him here."
"In Flaxford?"
"Living quietly, respectably. He has been among us for years." Purbright said nothing, and in that silence was the shape of who. Tolliver's voice did not tremble.
"It did not need to, Reverend Markby," Mally gasped. The cottage felt suddenly smaller. Purbright lowered his gaze, not in shock but in acknowledgement. Tolliver saw the recognition settle. "Yes," Tolliver said. "The man preaching virtue 5 times every Sunday was once the man who convinced accountants to look the other way. He did not simply flee punishment. He fled himself. And for a time he became something better." His tone was not accusing. It was almost pitying. Purbright sat now, gently, deliberately. "You rang the bell to tell him you knew." Tolliver nodded.
"To give him warning."
You see, Inspector, I did not come here for retribution. I came here because I wanted to know whether he had changed, whether the life he built was real, whether the man I once saw at his worst had found at last something better to be. Mally whispered. And did he?
Tolliver's hands opened helplessly. I
believed he had. Purbright exhaled softly, a small sound of shared sorrow for human frailty. But then, Tolliver continued, voice hollow, the coffin was disturbed. Someone wanted to be sure the story of Ambrose Quilteen of Harwood remained intact. Someone wanted the lie protected. Someone who feared exposure, Purbright spoke gently. That someone was not Markby. Tolliver looked up sharply. Purbright's gaze was steady, compassionate, unflinching. No, he said. It was the man who collected the coffin, the man with the green wax, the man who profited from Harwood's disappearance, the superior who did not wish an old trail of missing municipal funds examined anew. Tolliver stared, breath thin. You mean? Yes, Purbright said.
He found Markby before you did, Tolliver swayed.
As though struck by a wave he could not brace for. Purbright rose, speaking not as a man pointing to guilt, but to truth. Reverend Markby did not fake a life to escape justice. He built one to escape shame. There is a difference.
And you have given him time to make peace with it, Tolliver whispered. Then what happens now?
Purbright's answer was quiet, firm, gentle. Now, Mr. Tolliver, we speak to him, calmly. Mally looked tense. Tolliver nodded, slowly. Gratefully, brokenly, Purbright placed his hat back on. Some crimes, he said, do not require punishment. They require understanding.
But the man with the seal, he will require something more formal. Tolliver bowed his head. I will come, he said. Yes, Purbright replied.
I know, he opened the door. The bell tower, framed in morning light, stood silent. Waiting. Reverend Markby was in the church when they found him. Not conducting a service nor preparing one, but sitting alone in the front pew, hands resting lightly on his knees, gaze lifted toward the silent bell tower above. There was no surprise in his expression when Purbright, Mally, and Mr. Tolliver approached. There was instead a tiredness that had aged him 5 years in the span of one morning. Inspector, he said quietly, as though greeting someone long expected. I wondered how much longer I should have to wait. Purbright took the seat beside him, not opposite. They sat like two men discussing weather or church tiles. Tolliver remained standing a few paces back, hat in hand, face drawn and unreadable. Markby exhaled. You've discovered it then, he said. Not fear, resignation. Purbright's tone carried no triumph, only clarity. I believe you once bore the name Harwood.
And that you abandoned it. Yes, Markby said.
I was not proud of the man who wore it. Mally watched him closely, but Markby did not flinch. I did it to escape disgrace, Markby continued. But not only that.
I wished to become someone I could live with.
Someone I would not despise. He looked toward the altar, not seeking absolution, only acknowledging distance. And? Purbright asked gently. Markby's expression softened. For a time, I succeeded. Silence settled soft as dust on hymnals. I did not know Tolliver survived the old scandal, Markby said. When I saw him arrive in Flaxford 5 years ago, I thought it coincidence. I was terrified, yes. But he did nothing.
Said nothing.
He merely watched. And I perhaps believed forgiveness was possible. Tolliver closed his eyes. Something like grief, not anger. Purbright said, The coffin. That was arranged by someone else. Someone who wished you to stay hidden. Someone who profited once from your disappearance and feared questions returning. Markby nodded. The superior.
He visited me last winter.
He told me that all was settled, that I was safe here, So long as I did not draw attention. Mally spoke then, voice low. And you believed him?
Markby looked at his own hands. I wanted to. Purbright's voice was kind but precise. And when the coffin was removed, when the bell rang, you knew your piece had come to an end. Markby swallowed.
Yes, he did not weep. He simply looked older, Purbright stood. So the matter now is this. You have lived 5 years in Flaxford, served the parish,
Harmed no one.
There is no outstanding warrant.
Your past crime was
Silence, evasion, and shame. Markby closed his eyes. Yes. Tolliver stepped forward then, slow, hesitant, as if each step were chosen with deliberate care. I did not come here to destroy you, he said. I came because I needed to know whether the life you built was real. Whether it mattered? Markby looked up, and the expression was not guilt but astonishment, as though forgiveness were an unfamiliar language, half remembered. Tolliver continued. And it was real. You changed. You became better.
I needed to know that.
For my own sake, too. The church was utterly still, as though stones and hymns alike were listening. Purbright spoke quietly. The law has nothing to demand here, but the truth, once known, cannot simply be folded away again.
Flaxford will know something occurred.
But it does not need to know everything. Markby breathed out, relief mixed with sorrow. Thank you, he whispered. Purbright nodded once. But the man with the seal, he added softly, will not enjoy such courtesy. Tolliver's jaw tightened. Markby lowered his head. Yes, Purbright said simply. We will deal with him. A week later, life in Flaxford resumed itself in the way small towns do, with adjustments so subtle they are seldom spoken aloud. The Clarion printed a brief notice. St. Cuthbert's bell mechanism was subject to accidental use. Repairs and documentation procedures have now been standardized. Reverend Markby continued his sermons, slightly quieter, perhaps gentler. Those who sensed a change could not have said what it was, only that something in him had softened or settled, like dust after a long movement. Mr. Tolliver appeared in church more often now, not watching, but participating. He sat where he could see Markby, but did not stare. The distance between them was no longer dread, merely history. Mr. Rudge, to his relief, found that no one blamed him for anything. Indeed, some parishioners treated him now with faint reverence, as though he had endured a biblical trial involving boxes and moral ambiguity. He found it unexpectedly soothing. Miss Felicity Appleforth told the story of the bell at the Women's Guild, but so carefully edited and rearranged that it had become, by the time she finished, a moral fable regarding community vigilance and the importance of modest hats in cold weather. Limbury returned to polishing everything that could be polished, believing this to be the means by which the world remained upright. And Purbright? Purbright sat at his desk, writing his report. It was concise. It omitted names where names would do harm. It omitted events where events would do no good. He signed it with the calm finality of a man who understood that justice is sometimes best served when it does not draw attention to itself. He placed the report in the filing drawer, closed it, reached for his tea. The bell of St. Cuthbert's remained silent, which, for now, was enough.